Sick of the fatigue and fog? Fed up with the unpredictable flares? Hangry from the super restrictive diets? Hello, and welcome to the Crunchy Allergist Podcast, a podcast empowering those who, like me, appreciate both a naturally minded and scientifically grounded approach to health and healing. Hi, I'm your host, Dr. Kara Wada, quadruple board certified pediatric and adult allergy immunology and lifestyle medicine physician, Sjogren's patient, and life coach. My recipe for success combines anti-inflammatory lifestyle, trusting therapeutic relationships, modern medicine, and mindset to harness our body's ability to heal. Now, although I might be a physician, I'm not your physician, and this podcast is for educational purposes only. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. A huge welcome and thank you to our guest today, Dr. Leo Trasande. Dr. Trasande is an internationally renowned leader in children's environmental health. His research focuses on identifying the role of environmental exposures in childhood obesity and cardiovascular risks, and documenting the economic costs for policymakers of failing to prevent diseases of environmental origin in children proactively. After completing his undergraduate, public policy, and medical degrees at Harvard, he completed the Boston Combined Residency in Pediatrics and a legislative fellowship in the office of then Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton, and additional training in environmental health as well. He holds appointments at the Wagner School of Public Service and NYU's College of Global Public Health. He's perhaps best known for a series of studies published that document the costs that we see due to endocrine disrupting chemicals in the US and Europe. Dr. Trasande leads one of 35 centers across the country as part of the National Institutes of Health Environmental Influences on Child Health Outcomes program. He's author of the book Sicker, Fatter, Poorer: The Urgent Threat of Hormone-Disrupting Chemicals in Our Health and Future, and What Can We Do About It? Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Trasande, and it's a pleasure to meet you.
Likewise. Thank you for such a warm welcome. Really appreciate it.
We have been talking a little bit on the podcast about some of the influences of our everyday lifestyle decisions on our health. But maybe you could explain to us, to start, what are endocrine disrupting chemicals?
Endocrine refers to hormones in our bodies, and just boiling it down, they're signaling molecules. The more we understand human biology, the more we appreciate that that actually is a very big tent. We used to think of endocrine as testosterone, estrogen, and thyroid, and sex hormones and thyroid hormone for body temperature. Now we appreciate there are 1,000 or so signaling molecules out there that have all sorts of bodily functions. They're basically the telecom system for the human body. When we're talking about those molecules, those are natural molecules. When we're talking about endocrine disrupting chemicals, we're talking about synthetic chemicals, foreign chemicals, not designed with the human body in mind. These chemicals, some we used to think this was the only way you could do it, but this is one way now. Many look like the hormones themselves and mimic it and do things that are different than the hormone was intended to do. They produce different effects. Now we realize that in this complicated world where genes are regulated by other signaling to produce DNA and then proteins, if you will, in the human body, that you don't actually have to mimic a hormone to hack a hormone. You can actually hack a hormone in all sorts of different other ways as well. The universe of chemicals, and we're still scratching the surface, that can hack hormones are on the order of at least 1,000. And that's just based on what we've tested. When you look at the broader universe that we haven't tested, there's so many probable endocrine disruptors that we haven't even scratched the surface. That could keep us gainfully employed for a long time, which is not a good thing. Really, the ideal world is that we would test chemicals before they're used and make sure they're hormone safe before introducing them into the big bad world.
From my understanding, how our system is set up now, it's innocent until proven guilty, correct?
Yes, generally speaking, there's been some progress. I would say at the end of the Obama administration, there was an update to the Toxic Substances Control Act, This is the EPA's regulatory permission to see over chemical safety. But if you go, for example, to the Food and Drug Administration side, there are some huge holes when it comes to chemicals unintentionally, intentionally added to food. And then when you get into the cosmetic and personal care product space, there's an entire loophole called the fragrance loophole. You could practically drive a truck through it because if it's a fragrance, you don't have to even admit what's in it. You just say, it's a fragrance, trade secrets. See you later. That means we have to do a lot of detective work to figure out what's in the fragrance to just get started. Often it's chemicals we know about. That's good. But it's equally often new chemicals that are coming on the scene. The reality is we live in a world of 80 to 140,000 chemicals, 1 to 3,000 new chemicals coming on the market each year. This pot is becoming more and more of a witch's brew.
How did you get involved into this work or get interested in this area?
When I applied to medical school, I was more interested in healthcare policy. That was because I kept getting all these annoying interview questions about the Clinton healthcare plan. This is before Obamacare, mind you. So I said, okay, I'm going to take a year. I'd gone straight from college to medical school. I was a little young and I could take a little extra time. I decided to get a master's in public policy from the Kennedy School of Government. That really transformed my mindset and I was hooked, if you will. I had capital fever. I decided to get a year in of additional training after my pediatric residency and had the privilege of working for then Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton. I was told to work on children's and environmental health. When I thought about that, I said, okay, I've got the child health part down, but the environmental health part I'll figure out. Boy, was I in for a surprise. The average medical student gets like 1 to 3 hours of environmental health in his or her training. So to assume that I knew everything coming in was crazy. And then to realize how big a threat environmental factors are in human health was transformative. The policy impacts that you can have on environmental exposures are profound. For me, this was a perfect opportunity to bring my public policy interest, my medical training. Then I decided to get some additional training in environmental health. That started me on this career where I'm studying populations of mostly kids and moms, but I'm starting to look more at safety and protect us all.
It's interesting you mentioned the lack of education in medical school. I have joked. So my dad is retired public health. He worked for the Illinois Department of Public Health his entire career. And I joked with him in conversation when they were visiting recently that I think I learned more growing up at the dinner table with him about water safety and lead poisoning and all of these different things than I ever encountered in my education. I had a similar training pathway. I did med peds, so had that peds background. Even in allergy immunology, we're talking with patients about eczema, about these different conditions that have a lot of, and asthma as well with air pollution and so forth, but very little time is spent on the actual environmental triggers, the different chemicals and all of those sorts of exposures. Why should we be, that is a natural segue, why should we be concerned about these things?
Just to dwell on that, I think one of the things we have in common here is that we're really focused about prevention. We are trained in the context where you are paid, if you will, for treatment. The financial model is misaligned in some ways with the model that actually improves overall health. We used to think that prevention wasn't that important. So I have empathy for the fact that the model needs some changing, but we can't blame the messenger of that model, the medical schools necessarily. We just have to try to transform it. That's because science has taught us that these synthetic chemicals, for example, that hack our hormones, contribute to a host of consequences. The first populations that these effects were identified were in kids. Kids were our sentinels with implications for us, with protecting us. We found that thyroid hormone was crucial for a baby's brain development much before. That's why we check heel sticks in newborns, make them cry, get a little blood, and we make sure they don't have congenital hypothyroidism, because you could treat that and prevent a lifetime of intellectual disability and other consequences. The newborn screening program is one of the crowning achievements of public health of the century. When you take a deeper look, though, it's not just gross misfunction of the thyroid hormone system. It's subtle effects on thyroid hormone, particularly not just in infancy in the newborn period, but in pregnancy, where you're relying on mom's thyroid hormone to supply a baby's brain with that growth factor. Ultimately, if you have subtle disruptions of thyroid hormone, clinically normal levels, but levels that shift, and those consequences include autism, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and cognitive deficits. When you dig deeper, flame retardants and pesticides, flame retardants used in electronics and furniture, pesticides used in agriculture, are hackers of thyroid hormone. When you look deeper, the effects on cognitive potential, but even images in the brain show the story. There's parts that are just not as well developed, and it matches the neuropsychological effects. That was really the first marker that these chemicals were bad, if you will, as a category. The more we dig, the more we realize the consequences run the entire body. We now have 50 or so chemical obesogens out there. Bisphenol A, or BPA, used in aluminum can linings and thermal paper receipts, is the prototype chemical that makes us fatter. It makes fat cells bigger directly, disrupts the function of a protein that protects the heart called adiponectin, and it's a synthetic estrogen that can have sex-specific effects on body mass. You have all the molecular hallmarks of something that makes you fatter. These non-stick chemicals that we are used to using in pans and in oil and water resistant clothing, called PFAS, perfluoroalkyl substances, the long term. These are chemicals profiled in Dark Waters, this movie by Mark Ruffalo. There was alluding to a massive contamination episode, industrial contamination of the water supply for many years, large lawsuit rolled up in the end. That, again, brings me in a way to another point about these chemicals. We used to assume only the dose makes the thing a poison. In that West Virginia episode, everyone, these are high-scale exposures, but we all have PFAS in our body. These PFAS are hacking our hormones at levels way below what you saw in West Virginia. Was just a good example of how things can get really pear-shaped quickly. It's sad to say that you have to use that as your starting point, but the deeper we dig, we identify effects. When it comes to metabolism, PFAS literally rewire the body's thermostat the wrong way. The metabolic rate is reduced, and in a population of adults who lost weight through healthy diet and good physical activity, regain their weight more if their PFAS levels were higher at the time that they stopped the diet and physical activity changes. In the study, we're literally talking about nothing that disrupts the paradigm that diet and physical activity are important for obesity and diabetes. But there's 3 legs to the stool, not 2. Environmental exposures, particularly synthetic chemicals that hack our hormones, are just that. So we've covered the brain, we've covered metabolism, but when you get in deeper, it's the human reproductive system that may actually be the most exquisitely sensitive of it all. We're not just talking about decreases in sperm count in men. We're not just talking about potency issues. We're talking about things that actually kill people. We're talking about heart disease in adults. We did a study very recently looking at phthalates. These are chemicals that make plastic softer, used in personal care products and cosmetics too, as fragrances most typically. But the levels of phthalates in adults' urine were associated with earlier death. And when you add up the potential consequences in the US population, you're talking about 100,000 deaths a year as a result. And that's a big economic cost, $40 to $47 billion, because if you die between the ages of 55 and 64, you're right at the peak earning years. And those dollars add up, ultimately. The broader consequences here for our economy of endocrine disrupting chemicals in the US are $340 billion a year, 2.3% of the gross domestic product. That's without that 40 additional that I just talked about before. We haven't talked about birth defects, about cancers, about allergies, but they're all on the list. That wasn't even counted in the $340 billion estimate. We looked at fewer than 5% of EDCs, a subset of diseases due to the few chemicals we studied, and a subset of costs due to the few diseases due to the few chemicals we studied. I'm not suggesting it's 100%, but that's an underestimate of an underestimate, full stop.
As you think about where do we go from here? What are certain things that you're doing or that you would recommend to patients or families?
I'm always going to tell you further research is needed, but we have enough to act. So let's talk about the research first, and then we'll talk about the actions. We're putting together cohorts of moms and kids, typically, looking at environmental exposures. We have one here in New York City where we're following about 4,000 mothers and kids, getting urine samples in 3 time points of pregnancy, following the kids, the oldest kids, 5 now, putting them through a battery of tests. That's part of this NIH Environmental Influences on Child Health Outcomes programs. We're collaborating in a national consortium that actually in the end will be 50,000 kids. We have the opportunity to look at questions that you can't look at in a single population just because you need a very large sample for rare conditions. Eczema is not that rare. Certain types of allergies are relatively rare. They're getting more common. Teasing that out is really important and hasn't been done well in previous studies. That's the kind of flavor, and we're also building out some capacity to look at effects in adults too over time of these exposures and looking at newer chemical exposures. One of the things we haven't talked about yet is regrettable substitutes. One prototype example is bisphenol A, about BPA-free in baby bottles and sippy cups. It made it in the news. It was the companies that ran to the FDA and said, please ban BPA. But they replaced them with artists formerly known as BPA, like BPS, BPF, BP, 40 or so of these regrettable substitutes. BPS is as estrogenic, as persistent in the environment, and as toxic to embryos. Basically, we swapped out one problem for another, and we still haven't banned BPA in aluminum cans. This is true with PFAS too. We had long-chain PFAS. PFAS are fluorine carbon-rich bonded atoms, and the number of carbons was usually 8 to 12. The industry said, well, let's make 4 to 8 carbon compounds, and they'll get out of the body faster because they're not so hard to excrete. The PFAS that are short chain have the same effects as PFAS than long chain for gestational diabetes. And that's going to keep us gainfully employed for a while in studying these effects. But let's talk about what we need to do, because that's really important. There are 2 things. There are safe and simple steps we can take as individuals to reduce our exposure. Then we need to advocate for the change we believe in. Those safe and simple steps don't require a PhD in chemistry. They don't have to break the bank. Avoiding canned food consumption, straightforward way to reduce your bisphenol levels in the urine. Saying no to that thermal paper receipt. Just ask for an e-receipt. It's a lot easier if your store will do it. That actually saves 2 people the exposure because there's the cashier as well as the person who's purchasing the product. Then eating organic, straightforward way to reduce your pesticide levels. It works in high income and low income populations. The big box stores, you're starting to see conventional and organic side by side, similar prices. That's because the market share for organics had double-digit percentage gains per year. That means that there's a economy of scale that's been put into place that reduces the price. Let's talk about plastics. It's not the year of the graduate anymore. We need to renegotiate our relationship with plastics. So fundamentally, it's about reducing. It's less about recycling. Recycling, yes, we need to recycle, but we have way too much plastic to begin with. Our recycling chains are not working well, with 9% of plastic being recycled functionally. I can talk all I want about the ecological effects. These are chemicals that are hacking our hormones too. If you have to use plastic, avoid the numbers 3, 6, and 7. 3 are for phthalates, 6 is for styrene, a known carcinogen, and 7 are for those bisphenols we talked about. But it's also about avoiding microwaving and machine dishwashing plastics, because those chemicals are not necessarily covalently bound to the plastic. If you heat them or you use harsh chemicals to disrupt that layer, you're undermining and breaking down the chemical bonds that keep the chemicals in the plastic in the first place. Now, stainless steel and glass are great alternatives, and you're starting to see companies step up their game. Tetra Pak is not as great, but it's better than some of the plastics that we've talked about. If it's obviously etched or scratched, it's time to throw it away. For nonstick chemicals, the thing to do is to go stainless steel or cast iron. It's a little extra elbow grease, maybe a little extra soap in terms of washing off those pans. I've dealt with those, I get it. It's a little workout, which get 2-for-1 deal. The last thing is just simply opening the window and recirculating the air gets rid of these chemical dusts that can linger from electronics and furniture in particular, those persistent organic pollutants. I'll stop there for a minute. Those are the safe and simple steps. That's probably like the 3.5-minute version as opposed to the 60-second elevator pitch that we use with our patients. And I tell patients all the time, I work at the flagship for the public hospital system, Bellevue Hospital in New York City. 10 years ago, I wouldn't talk about this because the price points were not the same. The intervention data were not as strong, but now I do. That's because we've come such a long way in this space. We've seen that these interventions work in low income as well as high income populations.
Forgive me if I'm wrong, but there's some data that would say that some of our low income populations are at the greatest risk.
That's right. Unfortunately, there's been, call it environmental dumping, environmental racism. Sometimes products are marketed to certain individuals on the basis of the color of their skin or their background or their income situation, and that magnifies exposures. That means that there's a greater burden of disease and a greater cost that they bear as a result of industries benefiting. That's double racism. There's just no way around it. And that's shameful at every level.
In thinking through kind of everything, is there anything that we missed that you love to tell the world?
We haven't gotten hopeful yet. There's a lot of hope. The millennials and Zs of the world have taken on to environmental contamination with gusto. It's through the lens of climate change, and petroleum-based companies are the core drivers of both. Now, you can cool the planet, but if you don't deal with the contamination issue, you're not going to be able to enjoy the planet. That's why they get it. So I have a lot of hope for the future in that respect. The other thing is we've seen so much change happen faster. Getting nonstick chemicals phased out food packaging was easy. A study of 5 packages found these chemicals. 2 major supermarket chains said, uh-oh, got to get that out. And it was all over social media. The BPA story in baby bottles and sippy cups is not perfect, but it's a good example of quick change that can happen. The power of the pocketbook or wallet in driving positive change. Companies do listen. They don't want to lose. And the companies that are doing the right thing and using safer alternatives are gaining market share. I happen to work with some of them, full disclosure, because I'd like to advise the folks who are doing the right thing and are willing to listen to these issues. That's the way forward. Yes. Do we need change in regulatory policy? Agreed. Is it the first step or the second step? Usually it's the second step. It should be the first step, but we live in a world where it's challenging to make that business case in a way that's super compelling without getting a lot of resistance. So we need to be flexible in our approach.
So where can people find out more about your work?
I have a personal website, leotrasande.com or sickorfatterpoorer.com. On social media, Instagram, Twitter, Leo Trasande, Trasande. There's a way to pass emails to me and ask questions. I'm always open.
Thank you so much. I would encourage our listeners, if you haven't read Sicker, Fatter, Poorer yet, it is a really great read. And I really appreciate at the end, just as in our conversation, you really do bring around that the element of hope, because I think you read through, especially as a mom of 3 and put the personal hat on with my own autoimmune issues and so forth, there is hope for the future. And there are these really sustainable steps that we can take in our everyday habits that really do make a huge difference in our exposure. And in the end, will end up saving us money, which can be on the front of everyone's mind. I thank you so much for your time and appreciate your expertise. And thank you for writing the book and all the work you're doing. It's much appreciated.
It was a joy. Thanks again.
If you have found this information helpful and empowering, I would strongly encourage you to hop over to www.crunchyallergist.com and subscribe to our weekly newsletter where we dive into all things allergy, autoimmunity, and anti-inflammatory living. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I look forward to talking again next week.